Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Future Tech Podcast. This is Juliet Lamar, and joining us today is Maciej Kranz. He is, among so many other things, he is an author, and currently he's an innovator at Cisco. Welcome, Maciej.
Thank you, Juliet. Thank you for having me over.
Oh, it's fantastic. My pleasure. So we have a lot of things to talk about today, but let's go ahead and kick it off with something that you have a lot of knowledge about, which is the crypto and blockchain world. And you and I were chatting earlier about, there's so many misconceptions out there about this space. So let's jump right in.
Sounds great. You know, when I've been sort of involved in the blockchain world for a couple of years, and so I've sort of seen the hype, and now sort of we're marching towards reality. But so many times, and I'm sure you've had the same challenge. We still have sort of conversations that sort of surprise me at this stage, and a lot of misconceptions and myths about blockchain. So the first one, of course, is I would say in half of the conversations when I mention blockchain, usually the response is, yes, I love crypto and I love the ICOs, right? Like, okay, great. And of course, as we both know, and as you've been covering a lot of this, of course, blockchain has, and the Bitcoin and other cryptos have the common roots, but blockchains are actually are used for much more than just cryptocurrencies, right? And crypto is just one of applications. So that's sort of one myth that I encounter very often. The second one is around public versus public blockchains. So obviously the underlying blockchains underneath crypto are public and permissionless blockchains, but in the especially B2B world, in the business settings, we're seeing more and more private permission blockchains being deployed. So there's a lot of different flavors of blockchains, and quite often, depending on the environment and the use cases. Probably another myth that I see a lot is blockchain is all about the financial services industry. And again, when you think about hype, right, that it's funny, when we started on our blockchain journey a couple of years ago, we actually went through around 200 different use cases and workflows, and we identified 5 that were actually ready for prime time. And we started with the financial industry, and of course, some of the iconic sort of use cases, like taking transactions like stock transactions from settlement time from 3 days to 0, right? T3 to T0 is sort of this big goal for the industry, and we found that to a large extent it's a red herring, because you can do actually a lot of T0 type of transactions today, but at the same time, the market structures, at the same time, the participants don't have a lot of incentives to actually reduce that time. Versus syndicated lending, where there's several players that exchange billions of dollars in transactions, they actually have a lot of incentives to reduce the reconciliation time and the settlement time. So looking beyond the technology into the market structures, the workflows, the motivations of the players has been key. And as a result, for example, at Cisco, we focused a lot on the supply chain and the use cases in this segment, as we're seeing sort of very clear ROIs, and the participants in the market are ready for those. So there are many more misconceptions and myths, but these are sort of the main ones that I've seen.
Absolutely. And, you hear these different myths time and time again, and it's interesting that these myths keep perpetuating in such a way. Yeah,
and partly it's, I think, because prior to blockchain, I spent a lot of years with Internet of Things, and so over there we went through the sort of the big hype cycle as well. And I have to admit, I think the blockchain and sort of blockchain hype, I think, is even greater. So as a result, there's a lot of conversations, and sometimes we, at least I find that we sort of repeat these myths, right? Because as people sort of learning, they sort of learn from each other, and then as collectively as our knowledge sort of deepens, I think we sort of realize, okay, these are myths and these are not realities. But I think it's a reflection of the state of the sort of a knowledge and the state of the industry. We still have a lot of basic education that we have to go through.
Well, absolutely. And just for our listeners to know, you had a great deal of involvement in the creation of the Internet of Things and in that whole networking. Can you give us a little bit of background about that?
Yeah, sure. And it's actually, I actually do believe that blockchain and IoT are actually fairly tightly coupled. So I've been involved in IoT for maybe 15 years now, so way beyond before we actually called this thing IoT. And then a couple of years ago, we actually decided the timing was right to sort of make it big in IoT as an industry. We decided to adopt the IoT term that was sort of invented a decade earlier, and create a sort of coalition of the willing with hundreds of companies and research institutions and universities, startups, large companies. We created sort of this big ecosystem of companies and said, okay, let's make it real. Because the benefits of IoT were so compelling, right? And it wasn't about connecting devices. It was about the data that these devices were generating and how we can analyze this data and turn those systems into business outcomes. And I actually, I wrote a book about IoT as well, sort of, because I think it's so important that every organization, large and small, sort of gets started on their IoT journey.
And going back to, you said that blockchain and the Internet of Things, IoT, have a lot of commonalities. You care to expand on that?
Yeah, of course. I actually believe that Internet of Things by itself is not very transformational. You actually need sort of three more pieces to it. Of course, machine learning and AI and ML, because at the end of the day, it is about interpreting and analyzing the data. It is also about what we call edge computing or fog computing, which is sort of evolution of cloud into distributed clouds. If you connect, let's say, a bunch of vending machines we can connect them directly to the cloud because very few packets actually are sent from the vending machine saying, hey, I'm running out of cans, come on over and replenish the supply. But if you connect a connected vehicle, or if you connect a bunch of drones or an oil rig, it's not practical or economical to actually send all the data to the cloud for processing. So that's you process the data sort of at the source. And the last sort of a leg of this stool is blockchain, because you need to make sure that that the data you are getting, you need to trust that where the data is coming from. You can trust that this data is actually what it is presented to be. That you reduce the friction between multiple transactions among players as well. So we actually at Cisco, we were one of the founders of a Trusted IoT Alliance, designed exactly for that purpose, which was to bring the community of IoT players and blockchain players together to work on enabling some of these use cases, whether they are in supply chain, like tracking of counterfeits, or in healthcare, tracking healthcare records, or food safety, whatever the use cases are. How do we get IoT, blockchain, but also ML, AI, and fog working together to make sure that we see the business outcomes?
That's fantastic. So let's move into, there's so many things to cover. You're a man of many talents. You have two books that are out. One of them is a New York Times bestseller called Building the Internet of Things. And then you have a companion book that goes along with that called Building the Internet of Things, a Project Workbook. Give us a little insight into your books.
Yeah, so it was funny because I think it was like 5 years ago. I've been sort of on this mission of getting, as I mentioned, every company to get them started on the IoT journey, because I think it's so fundamental, as even we talked earlier. And I started to get questions. Is there a book that I can read? I'm a business owner. I run the hospital. I run the oil field. I run a plant. So from the business perspective, is there a book I can read that will sort of tell me how I can use IoT for my business benefit? And I couldn't find any book like that. So I decided to write one, and I published the book a year and a half ago, and I was actually surprised how successful the book was, which I think was the reflection of that there were a lot of people who heard the buzzword IoT and wanted to sort of see how they can make it useful for their business. But then also I started to get feedback from the readers of the book and saying, yes, I read the book, I'm ready, but I need some more hand-holding and help. Can you guide me through the process? Which is why a few months ago I published this companion workbook, which is basically step-by-step instructions. Sort of, you read the book, now let's sort of walk through and make sure that you're ready from the skill set perspective, from the process perspective, from the sort of the technology perspective. So it's almost like a bunch of checklists that you have to go through and make sure that before you get started, you're ready, then how to best get started on your first project, how to then continue on your second, third, and your 100th project as well. So it's a very pragmatic sort of a workbook, and I've been getting some very positive feedback on both of those as well.
And you have a third book coming out, is what I hear.
Not yet. I just started writing it, but it's sort of a working title is around what I call a co-economy, and it's some of the themes that we've discussed already, Juliet, right? Which is it takes the village, right, to get these things happen. Quite often, I still see the industry this concept of I am one large company and I can do it all. Where when you think about sort of solutions that we need to develop, they require multiple players to work together. Some specialists in infrastructure, in security, in databases, sort of horizontal sort of specialists, but also vertical specialists, people that know how let's say oil and gas industry or healthcare or retail or agriculture industries work. So they bring this sort of vertical knowledge, and also regional players, because how you deploy let's say a agriculture solution in India versus South Africa versus England versus US is very, very different, right? So combination of these players have to work together to develop and deliver the solution. So I think this is essential, and when you think about blockchain, it plays a key role in this as well, because blockchain is actually enabling, right, multiple organizations to transact, to record transactions with each other in a permanent and efficient way, right? So it's removing the friction and creating the trust. So it's one of the foundational enabling technology for this sort of a co-economy to exist and to thrive. But the book will not be published probably for another year.
Well, we'll just be waiting patiently for it, and that's fantastic. And that kind of leads me to my next question. You touched on a few things that you've learned by working in this space, but what do you think are some of the core things that you have learned simply by being so involved in the space that you might want to share with people?
Yeah, of course. And some of them I probably will repeat, but the first one for me is it takes the village. Whether you're in blockchain, whether you're in IoT, whether you are in sort of these emerging new markets and technologies, we have to work as an industry. I often worry about some of these early markets sort of balkanizing too soon. So sort of working together, creating ecosystems, I think, is the first one. The second one is, I often talk about Internet of Things. Yes, it has things in the name, but it is about people. And the same goes for blockchain as well, which is making sure that we have people who have the right skills, that we train those folks. In the IoT world, for example, there's a lot of sort of companies have to rethink how they work with their workforces. Just a little story. So I live in the valley, but hour and a half south of San Jose, there's another valley. We call it the Lettuce Valley in Salinas, and over there I sort of visited recently a plant where sort of a packaging plant where they're packaging lettuce, and on one side of this big hangar was a manual sort of line with 30 people working on it. On the other side, there was an automated line with 3 people working on it. And as the company was sort of automating these lines, they also were educating their workforce. So instead of being a line worker, the person was getting an engineering degree or a quality degree, and they sort of were increasing their skills as well, which ended up being a win-win for the company and the workers. We see companies working together on joining forces with educational institutions. So instead of getting a generic blockchain expert, you will get a blockchain expert that actually knows the supply chain use cases, right? Apprenticeships, another sort of area. But in general, it is about people. And the last piece for me is, think big, dream big, but start small. It is about the journey. Quite often, for example, I've seen with Internet of Things where you cannot just sort of come in and say, let's revamp our entire process, our entire organization. You first start with a small project like remote asset management or preventive maintenance kind of a solution. You succeed with it, you build a coalition of the willing internally and externally, and then you do the next one and the next one. So build on your success. But also, if you fail, it's not fatal either, because you will learn from your failure and you will sort of move on as well. So these are sort of the 3 things that I've seen over and over again that are sort of essential of making sure that these new technologies mature and the markets happen.
That's fantastic. And I love that saying that failure is not fatal. Failure is just another way to learn and really grow your ideas.
It's funny because in this building the Internet of Things book, I have a whole chapter 8, that talks about mistakes, right? And it lists around 25 different mistakes that organizations have been making. And my point also is that everybody makes mistakes. Let's learn from each other's mistakes, which was also sort of the call to the industry. Please share not only your successes, but also your failures. And it takes some courage sometimes to say, hey, I failed, but here are the lessons learned, and I'm willing to share so that collectively we will not make this mistake again, right? But that's what it takes. I think that, again, in the spirit of, it's not about our individual project, but making sure that the entire industry succeeds.
No, absolutely. And, with this knowledge that you have and this skill set, where do you see this going? What kind of cases do you see being used in the future that maybe haven't even been thought of yet?
Yeah, so I think that I would say IoT and blockchain are sort of at a similar stage right now, which is we are still focusing primarily on sort of improving existing processes. So like at Cisco, we've been focusing on use cases like counterfeits, so identifying and tracking counterfeits pieces of equipment or products. A lot of companies have these problems, right? And now blockchain enables us to actually have visibility and into the supply chain and provenance of goods and equipment. We see a lot of use cases around sort of removing friction from like supply chain finance. We see use cases around healthcare electronic records, and a lot of focus on food safety and food tracking. So, but I would say these are sort of the first steps. What excites me is when we start talking about creating new business models, like microtransactions, for example, micropayments is a fascinating area. It will be enabled by both IoT and blockchain, where instead of, let's say, paying for a tire, you sort of install the tire and pay manufacturer every 100 miles while you use the tire, right? So completely new business models, new value propositions like personalization that would be enabled by these technologies as well. And then new markets, like when you think about drones. Drones is a great example of a combination of IoT, blockchain, machine learning, and fog computing in action. So the early successes and improvements of existing processes are exciting because they validate the technology and make technologies useful. But then these new value propositions, new business models, and new markets, new industries is what I think excites me in the long run about the future.
That is a pretty bright future. I love that picture that you paint for us. Maciej, thank you so much for joining us. And what is the best way for people to, connect with you, to buy your book? You have so many speaking engagements.
Yep.
Yeah, what is the best way for people to follow you?
Probably the best way is obviously Twitter, LinkedIn, but also I have a website, maciejkranz.com, where I talk more about what we do. I also have a newsletter that I send out, so you can sign up for the newsletter at my website as well. So let's work together. Let's share the best practices, and let's share sort of bright future together.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Maciej, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Juliet. I appreciate it.
That is Maciej Kranz. He is, among other things, author, innovator, and extraordinary human. Check him out. His website is maciejkranz.com. Find him on LinkedIn, find him on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you all so much for tuning in. This has been Juliet Lamar with Future Tech Podcast.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.